Hi, my name is David Peterson. I'm an evangelical Protestant pastor located in southern Indiana and actually in Darmstadt, just north of Evansville, Indiana. I'm doing a series of videos, among the videos on my YouTube channel that I'm just now developing, on the thinking of Jordan Peterson, because he's aroused so much interest in the study of the Bible, of religion, and of how it applies to life. And I'm seeking to give an evangelical Protestant, use that term, pastor's perspective on what he's teaching, and suggest some ways a person might go beyond his merely psychological approach to that of a theological approach. And for this video, I want to talk about a book that relates, I think, a lot to what Peterson is doing. This is kind of a seminal book in the history of 20th century theology, for sure, and is still very influential in the 21st century. It's by a guy named George Lindbeck, who recently just passed away, was a professor of, I think, historical theology at Yale Divinity School. But in this book, The Nature of Doctrine, Lindbeck lays out three types of ways of approaching religion, of approaching Christianity specifically, is what he's dealing with here. And he suggests a post-liberal way of approaching theology. And so he is known as one of the founders, or at least one of the key figures in the post-liberal movement in modern Christianity. And he proposes a typology of looking at the way people approach the Bible through three different types. And when we think about those three types, I think Jordan Peterson fits neatly into the first type. The first type is experiential-expressive. That is, religions and the Bible and religious practices and texts that survive, these are expressions, so the term expressive, expressions of universal human experience, experiential expressive. And definitely this is something Jordan Peterson believes. He's approaching at it from his evolutionary psychology approach, so he says this experience goes back a long, long time in the history of our species, to be sure, that it's ingrained deep within us. He's going at it at a different angle than perhaps Lindbeck was thinking of. Lindbeck was thinking of liberal theology, specifically liberal Protestant theology, that had, especially in the 19th century, focused on this element of Christianity being an expression of religion generally, and that all of the religions share in this expressing the universal human experience. And so this is often associated, I think rightly, with liberal Protestantism, liberal Christianity. Now, I'm a moderate, conservative, evangelical Protestant, to try to be as specific as I can be. But I can appreciate this, and so I right away I want to say I'm just going to write off this approach. In fact, as I think about the three approaches I'm going to discuss here, I think that Lindbeck is bringing out various aspects of what religion is, and I do believe Christianity is true religion, and so this would be, but it participates in our human experience here on this earth, and so it shares in all three of these things. And this experiential expressive, one of the things as you study the Bible anyway in depth, you recognize that the Bible is not isolated from the people around it, or from the stories, the ways of thinking, the cultures. And I've done my own recent in-depth Bible studies that I do on Wednesdays with people who will gather here in the morning. And we've gone very slowly, doing a close reading of both Genesis, and now we're right in the middle of Exodus, using some of the better commentaries from today. And what keeps coming up is how ideas and concepts and practices that were there in the ancient Near East are taken up by the Israelites and transformed. I believe the Bible reveals itself to be inspired in a way that sets it apart, but not inspired in a way that it's totally detached from the cultures that surround it. It takes up those those very ideas and communicates new ideas, revealed ideas that show us more than we can get through general revelation. I spoke in another video about the difference between general and special revelation. I believe religions in general participate in what's called general revelation. They are expressions of the general knowledge of God, however brokenly. I don't believe they communicate that knowledge perfectly and in an unclouded way, but they contain truth. And that would be wrong, I think, from a Christian perspective to say that it would be wrong to say that they don't contain truth, because they participate in this general revelation. And so they are experiential, expressive forms of religion. And I don't follow those people who then, they label and define this approach, and then they say, well, then we just throw it out, because that's not my approach. I like what one of my favorite theologians has said, is that most people, theologians in theological schools, and you find this probably in any field, are right in what they affirm and wrong in what they deny. There's always an imbalance there. One of the reasons I really like this Gabriel Facker, he too died just recently. He taught at Andover Newton Seminary, died at the age of 92, taught theology there, is he always kept pulling to the center, and he was a centrist theologian, and I follow after him, because he was saying there's always something that's being rightly affirmed in some of these extremes, but the problem is that they deny things, and they over-affirm things. And so in the experiential expressive approach, I hold, yes, that there is a realm of shared universal experience. And Jordan Peterson is actually reaffirming that in a world that has lost the conviction that there's a shared universal experience, that there are these shared universal realities that we can then use to grade and judge various ways of being in the world. And that he generally affirms that that which has survived and has proven itself over time is to be generally trusted over just novelties, and trying to do it through sheer reasoning alone. And that's one of the reasons he affirms religion versus a true kind of Enlightenment rationalism that says we got to throw off tradition, we got to throw off religion, and we got to do everything all new using a kind of linear rational reasoning. And he really is great at attacking the idea that somehow we can have that kind of comprehensive knowledge of right behavior and just through sheer reasoning alone. And this has been his discussions with Sam Harris, the atheist, who has that kind of approach of like we can discover the truth of moral behavior just truly on our own through reasoning. And Peterson does a great job showing the complexity of life, that you have to figure out what's going to affect you today, what's going to affect you tomorrow, how it's going to affect you as the different person you're going to be down the road, how it's going to affect the people in your life, the people they affect. I mean, and all the way down to the very environment around us itself, that it's a very complex thing to move in this world, and we just don't have the capacity to make all those calculations. And he really argues for this shared experience that has come to be expressed in religion and tradition, and that we should accept it and receive it, not uncritically. And that's his whole idea of resurrecting the dead father. That is, it has to be reappropriated in each generation. We don't throw off the past, but we don't accept it all uncritically. He's not saying go back uncritically to the way it was, say, in the 1950s. But it's also recognizing, hey, there was a lot good in a lot of those values and traditions that were being lifted up at that time that are not often, and he's not really, I don't know if he's ever spoken of the 1950s, I'm speaking of that way, and he's trying to pull us back as a Western culture to not go into the extreme of a kind of throwing off of what has been such a blessing. And he's really pointing out the blessings that we're enjoying in spite of the fallibility and brokenness and wrong in the world. So that's the first type of religion that Lindbeck brings up, and he labels that experiential expressive. Liberal theology tends to follow that, and you find there then that they almost throw off sometimes that particular perspective, the unique aspects of Christianity. And I do think I see some of that in Jordan Peterson. He really focuses in on the shared experience, the psychological experience, and when he goes through his Bible stories, he doesn't really like to focus in on the unique thing of Christianity. Again, the shared thing Christians share with everyone else is a knowledge of the law, of the way one's supposed to live. And psychology, you might say, is a description of, the applied description of the law, the moral law. It's about how to do life, how to live in the world. And Paul says plainly that people have this written on their hearts. They show it, that it's written on their hearts. This is in the book of Romans, I believe, chapter 2. When they do by nature the things the law teaches. And those are the things that Jordan Peterson lifts up. He shies away from the uniquely Christian, which is the gospel, what God has done to redeem us from the curse of the law, from the fact that it stands over against us as a standard that we never meet, and it judges us, and it condemns us, and we fail. And that's really been the failure of liberal religion in general. Richard Niebuhr, speaking of the 19th century liberals, said it was a God without wrath who had a Messiah without the cross. I can't remember, but it was just an emptying of the uniqueness of Christianity. I'll have to remember that quote and commit it to memory. But it was something to the effect that all the unique things, a God without wrath, brought men without sin, and through the ministrations of a Messiah without the cross into this kingdom. It was just it was a bloodless, drained religion that was just focused then on being nice and being a moral person. And I would say, to a degree, that's really what Jordan Peterson focuses on. And I'm not bashing him on that. I think it's been refreshing because people have lost touch with that. But to stay there is to not go on to the theological and to the Christian. I don't think he's in the fullness of Christianity by any means, but he's pointing that way, which I think is helpful. The next one, Lindbeck talks about the cognitive propositional approach to religion. That is, that religion involves, Christianity involves doctrines, knowledge of those propositional truths expressed in doctrinal form and then understood in one's mind, so that it's a very mind-focused way of approaching faith. And some of the better Protestant writers, for example, after the Reformation were scholastics, and they were very detailed in breaking down what it is their particular tradition, whether it was the Protestant Reformed tradition, the Protestant Lutheran tradition. They would work out all of the details of it, showing the logic of it and how it fits with the Bible and with the received Christian tradition. And those are some of the best books I find for learning the ABCs of theology. Heinrich Schmid's the Doctrinal Theology of the Evangelical Lutheran Church is a book that does that. It breaks it all down, and you can really learn Lutheran theology, or any of the more Lutheran scholastics. Francis Pieper and Theodor Mueller, I think is his name. Two very scholastic, but great for learning Lutheran theology, the ABCs. On the Reform side, Heinrich Hepp's Reformed Dogmatics, Louis Berkhof's Systematic Theology, Charles Hodge, people like this, they go through and they spell it out in a very logical, cognitive kind of approach. And yet, as Lindbeck will show, that's focusing on one part of who we are. And in reality, the Bible doesn't come to us in that way. I mean, one critique of this is that if that is how religion is in its fullness, once you get all of the doctrines distilled into a systematic theology, all lined out in these definitions and propositions, why do you really need the Bible? Because what you have is you have all of the ideas. But one thing you notice is that the Bible is not merely one type of literature. You have some of those more cognitive propositional books, especially the letters of Paul, that are very reasoned out. And it's interesting, I think that's probably why conservative evangelicals in general have been drawn to the epistles, is because evangelicalism has, and Protestant Reformed theology especially, but Protestantism in general, when you think about it, Luther and Calvin were both academics and scholars. And so it's been drawn to that kind of thinking and that kind of arguing. But what Lindbeck argues is that's based on just a false view of how religion comes to us and of who we are as human beings. And philosophically, there are things that would bode against that alone as being the way that we are to approach God. And then he and I can speak more about that later. I don't want to get into a lot of the fine details. Finally, he brings up what he calls the cultural linguistic approach. And that is, he says that the Christian faith and other religions, in fact, everyone has a metaphysical assumptions and belongs to probably groups of people that share them and communities that have particular worldviews. And Christianity is a particular culture, a particular worldview. I don't think he uses the term worldview, but it's that, and it's a milieu in which a person lives and moves. And that a part of being a Christian is learning the culture and learning the lingo. The linguistic is the grammar of the faith he's talking about. And it says we're immersed in the cultural practices that we're being formed as Christians and throughout all of our being. Which again, I would say it does not exclude the propositional. Christianity has propositional doctrines. That is a part of the Christian faith. And there is an experiential universal experience. I think all three of these things apply. And that we become reductionistic if we just take one part of it and make that everything. And if you just stick with Jordan Peterson's experiential-expressive approach to the Bible, I think you are missing it. But likewise, if you are in a real conservative church and it's all about propositional truth and cognitive statements, that has been drained of the richness of the Christian faith, whereby we're being formed by the stories of the Bible. A large part of the Bible is story. Individual stories that form us, and then an overarching story. And this is where another term comes in, the idea of a canonical approach to Christianity. Canonical Christianity has been associated with the idea of a post-liberal Christianity as well. And post-liberalism is the cultural linguistic approach. Canonical Christianity is a way of saying that there is a canon of received texts. For Protestants, it's 66 books of the Bible. There's a whole discussion of why they choose those 66 and not the same exact books, but as the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox. But they share all three branches of the church share the majority of books together. And this canon of received texts itself forms an overarching story. In his work on early Christianity and first century Second Temple Judaism setting, N.T. Wright shows that even though they didn't have as worked out a theology, the Jews, they had this narrative of creation, fall, covenant. It was there. It was a part of the Jewish way of looking at the world. And they didn't approach it in this kind of propositional cognitive way. And so sometimes people say, well, they didn't really have a theology. But he shows, and I think convincingly, and the narrative itself shows it. I mean, you can see it just in the narrative itself, that there is a story that is told through all of the individual stories, a grand narrative. A great resource on the internet for understanding that great narrative as it's woven into every individual book of the Bible and all the little stories of the Bible are the animated videos done by the Bible Project. They say explicitly that that's how they're approaching the Bible. They don't call it a canonical approach, but that's what it is. That it's a story that's all about the Messiah, and that's what the New Testament people are affirming over and over again. When Jesus says on the road to Emmaus that he was showing the truth about himself in the Scriptures and their hearts burned, he was approaching it through this This is how it's all pointing to me. It's a grand narrative. It's a grand story. Again, one of my favorite theologians of mine, Gabriel Thacker, his systematic theology series, which I don't think he didn't ever finish. I have the ones that he did do, is called The Christian Story, a narrative interpretation of Christian doctrine. I think if one first reads the cognitive propositional approach of the more scholastic theologies, then reads this, you get a good mix together. To me, there's a lot of value still in that very ordered approach of the more definition and setting forth. This is the doctrinal statements, the ABCs of doctrine. But then when you then go and study someone like Thacker, he helps you see that you find yourself situated in a story, and you from the situation of that story begins to interpret reality for you, and you begin to see reality and see things in reality that you didn't see before, because you're being shaped by that story. And so this is another truth, and I think Jordan Peterson affirms this, even as he is making his justifiable attack against postmodernism. But one of the truths that comes out of postmodernism, and I think that there is an extreme. The extreme is that we don't share any universal space together. There is no overlap from the various worlds in which we inhabit, that we can come together in that area and say, this is shared knowledge. Again, in other places I've talked about how science itself is a way in which we have a shared space. And through that shared space of shared knowledge, we're producing all this wonderful stuff, where I can be on the internet like this, because of all the work that's been done. So it's just a fact that we share space. But the truth that has come out of postmodernism is that when you inhabit a particular space, your beliefs, in fact, Jordan Peterson actually, in one of his classes on the Maps of Meaning, he shows the video of the people throwing the basketball back and forth. And then the gorilla comes in there. And if you're just looking at the basketball, what you're looking at will keep you from seeing the gorilla. And then the young people in the class, or I don't know if they're all young people, but the college students, they don't see the gorilla, and it's a surprising thing, and it really shows you how you can be shaped by what you're looking at. And he does a long section on this in the Maps of Meaning about how we don't go into a room and we don't hyper-focus on everything. If we did that, he talks about how LSD is really that stripping down of our focus, and it's letting all of reality hit us at once. I think that's what he was talking about. Hallucinogenics do that, and why it's such a trippy experience, because that capacity to be able to be intentional, and that how we are automatically intentional so that we can navigate life without being overwhelmed, and it helps us, but it also keeps us from seeing things. And so you see, that right there is a truth that I think is a truth in the postmodern view, or at least in the view that has come to question some of the supposed neutral places that people have been sitting at in a space in which they've claimed to have kind of a neutral, untouched perspective. No, being into this tribal identity politics is the extreme expression, reductionistic expression of something that's true. We do have a standpoint, a place from which we're standing, and we do have ways in which we've been shaped to look and see certain things, and our perspective is expanded when we are interacting with people who are in other perspectives. And when we hear those other perspectives, our side is enriched. And something is lost when we don't hear those perspectives, because they help us to see things. I could get off on this topic. I was just listening to the radio the other day, and there's a young woman who just came out with a book, and I don't remember. I wish I remembered the name of it. It was a good book, and she's a black young woman, and was talking about her experience of growing up, And this book is about that experience and about how she navigated life and saw things differently, and how other people didn't see it the way she saw it. We could react right away and say, well, that's tribal politics or identity politics, and that can degenerate into that. But when we say there's no universal shared space as we're coming and looking at things, but she can help me see things that I don't see. And Jordan Peterson himself gives the basis for this in that lecture. You can find it when he's doing it on the gorilla. I mean, so there is a truth. It's just and the thing that I would think that he would affirm this because he's against a kind of reductionistic approach. That's what ideologies are in his mind. They're a reductionism. And so the idea that we don't have a neutral place to stand is to say that there's no foundation from which to build up knowledge that is value-free. A book that has helped me think a lot about this is this book, Beyond Foundationalism, Shaping Theology in a Postmodern Context. Again, all this can be taken to an extreme. I don't believe we're all hermetically sealed into our own little world and we can't communicate, and there's no such thing as universal human experience. But we all come shaped by our perspectives. In his New Testament and the People of God, as he's working out his methodology for approaching the New Testament, N.T. Wright develops what he calls the critical realist position. That is, we approach reality with the assumption that we're really in touch with it. But we approach it critically, recognizing that we have a tendency to distort. Part of the way we tend to distort it is by looking at certain things through our lens. But actually, Lindbeck says that's a part of what Christianity is supposed to do. It's supposed to enculturate you. It's supposed to give you practices, a whole way of life, in addition to a language, a grammar. And it's by being saturated with that world and absorbed in that world that we see the world as it is in a new light and see things in the world that we didn't see before because our eyes have been opened to see those things. And of course, as a Christian, I believe that part of that is having the Spirit of Christ in us, the Holy Spirit, who comes into us through that word which is about Him, and it awakens us to those things. So where am I going with all this? It's great, again, what Jordan Peterson is doing. I appreciate it very much, and I'm just wanting to say to people, that's one level of analysis, as he likes to say. That's a certain substrate of reality. But that's not everything. Indeed, the more you examine the parts that he doesn't cover as in depth, the parts about the gospel, the parts about what God was doing for humanity, there you begin to see that there's something unique to Christianity. I do believe that belief in the God of Christianity comes by faith. And in a previous video when I was talking about atheism, I brought up the Protestant theologian George Forel, who said that it's not by reason that we get to the Christian God. We, by reason, can get to a kind of general idea of God. I believe there's general revelation. But eventually there comes a point when one sees all of the weight towards belief in Jesus, and there comes that moment of critical decision. And why I continue to use the term evangelical Protestant in the midst of a world that's come to use that to mean some kind of political thing, is because evangelicalism still puts the accent, I think, rightly on the decision of faith. Now, theologically, we might be able to, look back and say, now, how did that decision happen? How God was at work? But the way we navigate and experience God in our lives from the level of our experiences is as we make that decision of faith, which sometimes feels like a leap. That we see it, we believe it, we're being pulled towards it, but yet there's still always room for doubt, because we're not in heavenly perfection of sight. And so that moment of letting go and throwing oneself on Christ is itself a revelatory moment. This is what evangelical Protestants have said This is what part of what defines an evangelical, is why they're often called born-again Christians, is they're saying it's as you let yourself go and are converted, and you throw yourself upon the living Christ, that you experience in that encounter and in that moment of trust a further awakening and a deeper sense that these things are true, and you begin to live through that, and that in itself points to the fact, that was the difference between Luther made between historical faith, head knowledge, so to speak, and saving faith. Saving faith is personal trust in what Jesus has accomplished for us. If you're enjoying these videos, I invite you to subscribe to my YouTube page. I want to do more on Jordan Peterson. I just think he's a great connection with people as a pastor, to people who are outside of Christianity, maybe considering it now for the first time. And also he's just good for awakening in us Christians about our own faith and thinking about it. And I want to do videos on other topics. Some will be as heady, you might say, as these ones. Others just more practical. As a pastor, I see myself as kind of a middleman between the academy and the scholarly work that's being done in everyday life. And I try to be as educated as a person as I can be to help in that way, and also to be able to explain it at different levels. And so these videos will be on different, I'll be approaching it from different angles and different levels of scholarliness, or at least going after these more heady ideas. So again, thank you for watching, and I do invite you to subscribe.